Ever wonder what really brought down the mighty Roman Empire? Was it the barbarians? The corrupt politicians? A serious shortage of marble for statues of emperors looking dramatically into the middle distance? Nope. It was germs. Yes, while the legions were out conquering Gaul, something microscopic was spreading all through the empire. Plagues. Lots of them. So put on your medical masks, because this is the story of how tiny, invisible killers, from mosquito-borne nightmares to diseases with names that sound like Roman generals, brought down an empire built on conquest and domination. It's the 2nd century CE. The Roman Empire is riding high. It's got swagger, sandals, and enough marble statues to make a modern Instagram influencer jealous. Roads stretch from Britain to the Middle East. The legions are crushing rebellions. The emperors are writing books and occasionally not being murdered. Life is, for once, kind of stable. Then, in 165 CE, Roman soldiers returned home from the east after fighting the Parthians, and they brought back more than shiny loot and stories about local cuisine. They're also carrying a surprise guest, a virus. Most historians now think it was smallpox, but no one at the time had any clue. They just knew people started dropping like flies all of a sudden. The symptoms were brutal. Fevers, chills, sore throats, vomiting, diarrhea, and the pièce de resistance, festering pustules that crusted over like bad pizza. Your body basically turned into a biohazard. People reportedly exhaled their souls as they died, which sounds poetic until you realize it probably just meant they coughed so hard their lungs gave up. The pandemic ripped through the empire like a gossip scandal in the Senate. By the time the troops reached Antioch in Syria, it was fully active. Dio Cassius, the Roman historian, said it raged to the greatest extent and killed as many as 2,000 people a day in Rome alone at its peak. That's basically the Roman Colosseum emptying out daily, except nobody's cheering. Entire cities were infected. Whole legions became useless. Soldiers died in their tents before even seeing battle. Farmers couldn't farm, merchants didn't trade, and priests were too sick to perform sacrifices. Though, to be fair, sacrificing probably wasn't helping at this point, and right in the middle of it all was Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Marcus tried to hold the empire together while his army evaporated and his citizens begged the gods for mercy. He wrote about courage and endurance, and then promptly died of the disease in 180 CE. Stoicism, great for your journal, not so much for your immune system. But here's what really makes the Antonine plague stand out. This was Rome's first true brush with empire-wide mortality. It exposed the cracks in the imperial system like never before. One disease, one tiny virus, spread from Parthia to Gaul, from Syria to Spain. Borders meant nothing. Roads, once a symbol of Roman engineering greatness, turned into highways of death. By the time the plague finished its grim tour, 5 to 10 million people were dead. That's around 1/3 of the population in some regions, more than the population of many provinces. And it wasn't just the bodies that piled up. The economy imploded. Taxes dried up. Morale hit rock bottom. Trade routes rusted. Cities like Rome and Alexandria went eerily quiet. Think of it like the ancient world's version of lockdown, except instead of sourdough and Zoom calls, you got mass graves and divine panic. This wasn't just a health crisis, it was the deadliest health crisis one could imagine at the time. And it was just the beginning. If the Antonine plague was Rome's unexpected punch to the gut, what came next was a full-on roundhouse kick to the soul. Just when the empire was starting to wipe its nose and get back on its feet, boom, another plague, another horror show. Only this time, it wasn't just about death. It was about transformation. Flash forward to around 250 CE. Rome is older, grumpier, and a little less shiny. The economy's wheezing, barbarians are being extra barbaric, and emperors are being assassinated so often it might as well be a job requirement. But things are about to get worse. Much worse. Enter the Plague of Cyprian. Named not for its origin, but for a guy who wouldn't stop writing about it. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, gives us the play-by-play like an ancient grim TikToker. Limbs were trembling, bowels were on fire, eyes bled, throats ulcerated, hands gangrenous. And that was probably before breakfast. The plague started in Ethiopia, spread through Egypt, and marched north like it had a vendetta. By the time it hit Rome, people were dying in the thousands each day. It was a disease that spared no one. Old, young, rich, poor. If you had a pulse, the plague wanted it. In fact, we still don't know exactly what it was. Smallpox, measles, hemorrhagic fever, or something even nastier that's now extinct. Here's what Cyprian reported in one of his letters, and brace yourself, it's like reading a medieval horror movie script. The bowels, relaxed into a constant flux, discharged the bodily strength. A fire originated in the marrow ferments into wounds of the throat. The intestines are shaken with a continual vomiting. The eyes are on fire with the injected blood. Not exactly the most poetic Yelp review. People weren't just dying. They were panicking. The air was thick with incense and dread. Funeral pyres smoked nonstop. Cities emptied. Entire villages disappeared overnight. And in a society that loved public events, forums, and temples, everyone suddenly became a social recluse. It was like the world collectively ghosted itself. Now here's where it gets wild. While Roman pagans were running for the hills, or dying in them, Christians stepped in. They nursed the sick. They buried the dead. They actually helped people. What was this? Compassion in Rome? The plague ended up being one of the most effective, if accidental, Christian marketing campaigns ever. As the Romans realized that Christians, previously considered heretics, were actually good people, their attitude towards them began to be normalized. Eventually, Christianity did become the official religion of the empire. So the plague of Cyprian didn't just devastate Rome biologically, it rewired the spiritual DNA of the empire, and as faith in the old gods rotted faster than the corpses, a new world was quietly taking shape, one funeral at a time. You'd think that 2 once-in-a-century plagues would be enough to get the empire a breather, maybe some time to heal. But no, just when the Romans thought they'd earned a break, they met a disease with fleas, buboes, and the vibe of an angry cat stuck in your toga. Welcome to 541 CE. The Western Roman Empire, long gone. The Eastern Empire, Byzantium, is holding on with manicured fingers and some very fancy architecture. And ruling it all was Emperor Justinian I, a man with ambition, vision, and a probably very stressed out immune system. He wants to bring back Roman glory, reunite the empire, build cathedrals, create laws, host the ultimate imperial glow-up, and then plague. Historians believe the Justinian plague began in Egypt and traveled to Constantinople via trade ships, specifically those carrying grain. But along with the wheat came rats, and on the rats, fleas, and in the fleas, the actual villain of our story, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. When it hit Constantinople, it hit hard. People woke up healthy and were dead by nightfall. Victims developed fevers, chills, delusions, and massive black boils, called buboes, on their neck, armpits, and groin. Imagine your lymph nodes turning into inflamed grapes of doom. Now imagine them popping. Yep. The stench was unbearable. Streets were piled with corpses. Burial pits overflowed. Graves were reused. People threw bodies into the sea. Entire districts of Constantinople became ghost towns overnight. At its peak, the city lost 10,000 people per day, so many that accurate records became impossible. People stopped counting. Officials stopped showing up. Labor shortages crippled agriculture. Cities fell into ruin. Trade networks collapsed. Military campaigns were abandoned. Food prices skyrocketed, and those who survived were left wandering through empty streets, past shuttered shops and echoing markets, wondering if the gods had abandoned them or if they'd just picked a new empire to mess with. Justinian himself caught the disease and survived, but his empire didn't bounce back so easily. Justinian's dream of reuniting Rome was dead on arrival. Literally. This wasn't a one-and-done deal. The plague came back in waves for 2 centuries, flaring up every 10 to 20 years like a terrible sequel nobody asked for. Some scholars estimate that between 541 and 750 CE, as much as 60% of the Eastern Mediterranean population died. This was more than a pandemic. It was a generational trauma. And while the Western world was slipping into the so-called Dark Ages, the Eastern Empire, Rome's final chapter, was trying desperately to fight a war against something you couldn't stab, bribe, or crucify. In the end, the plague of Justinian didn't just kill people, it killed momentum. It clipped the wings of a recovering empire and left it fluttering, half alive, into the Middle Ages. Not every killer wore such dramatic robes. Some preferred sandals, a subtle poison, and years of slow, grinding devastation. Now, we are moving on to everyone's favorite disease that played the long game. Malaria. It didn't come in with a bang. It lurched in, sat on the couch, and ruined dinner parties for centuries. Let's set the scene again. You're a Roman citizen. You've got a villa in the countryside, olive oil in your pantry, and a nice tunic that's only slightly wine-stained. Life is good, except for the part where everyone you know occasionally gets fever so high they start talking to kitchen utensils. You don't know it, but your marshy estate near the Tiber River is basically a 5-star resort for mosquitoes. And these aren't your average garden variety nuisances. These are Anopheles mosquitoes, the little monsters that spread Plasmodium falciparum, the most virulent strain of malaria. They buzz, they bite, and then, boom, you're suddenly sweating through your toga like you've just run a chariot marathon. The symptoms are vivid. High fevers, chills, vomiting, headaches, muscle spasms, and a general sense that your body is attempting to spontaneously self-destruct. But the weirdest part is that it comes and goes. You feel like death on Tuesday, and by Thursday, you're back to sipping watered-down wine and making snide comments about your neighbor's statues. Then, the next week, the whole cycle starts again. A fever roller coaster with no exit line. The Romans didn't know what malaria was, of course. Germ theory was roughly 1,800 years away, but they knew something bad was hiding in the air. In fact, the very name malaria comes from the Latin malus air, bad air. They thought the swamps and mists around Rome were literally exhaling poison, which, to be fair, is not a terrible guess considering how interesting marshes do smell. But what they didn't understand was that their glorious empire was being slowly hollowed out, not by barbarians or corrupt senators, but by the buzz of a tiny insect. In fact, malaria may have been the most persistent and destructive disease the Romans ever faced. It was endemic, meaning it never really went away, and plagued the empire from the very beginning until its final gasps. The worst hit area was, ironically, Italy itself, especially the lowlands near Rome and the Pontine marshes, which at one point were so swampy and mosquito-ridden that entire stretches of farmland were abandoned. Farmers fled. Settlements crumbled. Even soldiers stationed nearby grew too weak to fight. And this wasn't a one-time event. This was generational. Here's the kicker. As the empire expanded into warmer, wetter regions like Egypt, North Africa, and parts of Asia Minor, it brought infrastructure, aqueducts, and roads, but also inadvertently created the perfect conditions for mosquito breeding grounds. Yay, progress. And while the poor were most at risk, no screens, no netting, just vibes, malaria didn't care about your social rank. It hit emperors, senators, generals, even entire legions. Some modern scholars even argue that malaria played a major role in the decline of the Roman Empire. Not just because it killed people, but because it sapped energy, reduced birth rates, weakened military strength, and slowed economic productivity. Try collecting taxes when your citizens are either delirious or dead. Try holding the frontiers when your troops can barely hold a spear. And here's the final twist of the mosquito's dagger. Malaria didn't just hit humans. Some research suggests it even affected livestock and horses, which means fewer cavalry charges, fewer food supplies, fewer sacrifices to Jupiter. If that's not a full-spectrum catastrophe, I don't know what is. Let's be real, no one ever made an epic movie about malaria. There's no Gladiator 2 fever dreams. But if we're measuring impact, this quiet, sneaky killer may have done more to erode Roman power than entire barbarian hordes. While the empire built temples, aqueducts, and marble monuments to its greatness, malaria was digging unseen graves in the countryside. When Romans got sick, they turned to medicine. Unfortunately, Roman medicine was often less science and more creative storytelling with herbs and vibes. Their all-star physician was Galen of Pergamon, the closest thing the empire had to a celebrity doctor. He was the doctor, Oz of his time, minus the TV show and the green smoothies. Galen believed the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. You weren't sick because of germs. You were sick because your bile was having a temper tantrum. Having a high fever meant too much yellow bile. Depression was a sign of your black bile staging a coup. The cure, according to Galen, was to balance the humors, ideally by draining your blood, applying a paste made of mashed herbs, or being scolded into health by your physician. Some of the methods used by the Romans are questionable, to say the least. In ancient Rome, bloodletting was the medical equivalent of duct tape, overused, questionably effective, and applied to everything. By the end of a Roman hospital visit, you might have lost half your blood volume and gained a new respect for untreated illness. And then there were the leeches, which doctors stuck on patients like organic Band-Aids with teeth. The logic was simple. If your blood was bad, just let something slurp it out. They also swore by poultices, a word that sounds sophisticated until you realize it means crush some plants, smear it on, and cross your fingers. For example, if you had a fever, a Roman doctor might mix boiled cabbage with honey, wrap it in linen, and stick it to your forehead like some kind of salad-themed Band-Aid. If you were lucky, it smelled terrible and attracted bugs. Of course, every Roman kitchen doubled as a pharmacy. Garlic, vinegar, and wine were considered miracle cures. Garlic for infections, vinegar for wounds, and wine for just about everything else. Disinfectant, painkiller, or, when things got really bad, a way to forget your doctor's entire treatment plan. On the other hand, surgery, while technically a thing, was a terrifying prospect. Roman surgical tools looked like they were forged by someone who had never seen a human body but had a deep love of fishhooks and blades. Surgeons operated without gloves, anesthesia, or consent forms. If you needed something removed, a cyst, an arrowhead, a bad spirit, you were tied down, handed a stick to bite, and told to think happy thoughts. And of course, no talk whatsoever of anesthesia. The closest the Romans got to pain relief was alcohol, opium, if you were rich, or fainting from blood loss. The phrase, "this might sting a bit," didn't exist. It was more like, try not to die from shock. Interestingly, Rome did have hospitals, mostly military ones, but they were a far cry from modern clinics. No crisp white sheets, no soothing background music, just a crowded ward of sweaty men, loud groaning, and the occasional rat looking for leftovers. To their credit, Romans did some things right. They understood the importance of clean water, public baths, and sanitation. Well, sort of. Their aqueducts were marvels of engineering, and the public bathhouses were the social hubs of hygiene, gossip, and fungal infections. But when it came to disease prevention, they were still guessing. Without germ theory, Romans figured if the gods weren't angry, maybe you just needed to stop eating figs at night. All of these problems were the reason why during the times of plague, desperation ramped up. Some turned to prayers, amulets, or spells. Others blamed foreigners, the gods, or astrology. Still, let's not be too smug. 2,000 years from now, historians will probably look at our own medical practices and laugh. Ah, yes, they'll say, 2020's humans believed inserting hot stones between their toes realigned their liver energy. Also, they thought kale could cure sadness. So, yeah, Roman medicine was heroic, well-intentioned, and occasionally just a really expensive way to die. You had brave doctors doing their best, patients holding on to hope, and a healthcare system held together by garlic, leeches, and sheer willpower. Knowing this, it is no wonder that the diseases we talked about above were such a massive problem to the thriving, glorious civilization of Rome. Rome may have fallen to barbarians, bad emperors, and budget deficits, but disease was the real MVP of imperial collapse. Tiny microbes did what no army could. They broke the greatest empire of its time, one sneeze at a time. Thanks for watching and subscribe for more history content.